Hey everybody, this is chapter 7 of Marx Labor Power Working Class by Tronti. Chapter 7 is titled What the Proletariat Is. Here we go. Already back in his day, Lukács had set these imposing words of Marx's as the epigraph for one of his own later disavowed youthful essays, quote, "It is not a question of what this or that proletarian, or even the whole proletariat, at the moment regards its aim. It is a question of what the proletariat is, and what, in accordance with this being, it will historically be compelled to do." Unquote. Unquote. Marx. In The Holy Family, faced with the critical critique, the worker is presented as he who, quote, creates everything, end quote, to the point that even his spiritual creations, he puts all critique to shame. In his spiritual creations, he puts all critique to shame, something of which the British and French workers have provided a great deal of evidence. Quote, "The worker creates even man," end quote. For it is true that, quote, "man has lost himself in the proletariat," end quote, but at the same time, quote, has not only gained theoretical consciousness of that loss, but through urgent, no longer removable, no longer disguisable, absolutely imperative need, the practical expression of necessity, is driven directly to revolt against this inhumanity, end quote. The form of this rebellion, first of all, comes out in the most evident, strident, and immediately revolting way on account of poverty and misery as part of the contradictory essence of private property. The proletariat and wealth are, indeed, antithetical terms within a whole that comprises both. Quote, "Private property as private property, as wealth, is compelled to maintain itself, and thereby its opposite, the proletariat, in existence. That is the positive side of the antithesis, self-satisfied private property. The proletariat, on the contrary, is compelled as proletariat to abolish itself, and thereby the proletariat's opposite, private property, which determines the proletariat's existence, and which makes the proletariat the proletariat. It is the negative side of the antithesis, its restlessness within its very self, dissolved in self-dissolving private property," end quote. Marx. The proletariat class thus feels itself continually being destroyed in this condition, and the proletariat class, in turn, continually rebels in order to destroy this condition. Quote, "It is, to use an expression of Hegel, in its abasement, the indignation at that abasement," end quote. Marx. Out of the two antithetical terms, the first thus works to conserve the antithesis, and the second works to destroy it. Quote, "Within this antithesis, the private property owner is therefore the conservative side, the proletarian the destructive side. From the former arises the action of preserving the antithesis, from the latter the action of annihilating it," end quote. Marx. It is true that through its economic movement, private property itself heads towards private property's own dissolution, but only by means of a development that is independent of private property, of which it is unconscious, and which takes place against private property's will. Quote, "Private property drives itself, towards private property's own dissolution, only in as much as private property produces the proletariat as proletariat, The proletariat executes the sentence that private property pronounces on itself by producing the proletariat," end quote. Marx. This is the sense in which, quote, "its aim in historical action is visibly and irrevocably foreshadowed in its own life situation as well as in the whole organization of bourgeois society today," end quote. Marx. All this was clearly expressed already in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher. Quote, "If constructing the future and settling everything for all times are not our affair, it is all the more clear that what we have to accomplish at present. I am referring to a ruthless critique of all that exists," end quote. Marx. Of course, this is not a matter of raising the banner of dogma, quite the contrary. communism above all is a dogmatic abstraction, insofar as it is, quote, itself only a special expression, Erscheinung, of the humanistic principle, an expression which is still infected by its antithesis, the private system, end quote. Marx. Not without good reason, communism has seen other socialist doctrines rising up before communism, and today it is itself but a particular unilateral realization of the socialist principle. And the whole socialist principle, in turn, is nothing but one aspect of the problem, that which concerns the reality of the true human essence. But we likewise ought to concern ourselves with the other object, the judgment on things such as things really are, as things exist. Quote, there is nothing to stop us, quote, making criticism of politics, participation in politics, and therefore real struggles, the starting point of our criticism, and from identifying our criticism with them, end quote. Marx. The positive possibility of emancipation, in fact, resides, quote, in the formation of a class with radical chains, mit radikalen Ketten, end quote. A class that does not demand, quote, any particular right, end quote, for itself, in which, through its universal existence, heralds the dissolution of society as a particular state. Quote, by proclaiming the dissolution of the hitherto existing world order, the proletariat merely states the secret of the proletariat's own existence, for it is in fact the dissolution, factische Auflösung, of that world order. By demanding the negation of private property, the proletariat merely raises to the rank of a principle of society what society has made the principle of the proletariat. That without its own cooperation is already incorporated in it as the negative result, negativus Resultat, of society, end quote. Marx. Hence, the more that the working class revolt makes headway on this material practical terrain, the more it acquires a theoretical and conscious character. Quote, recall the Song of the Weavers, that bold call to struggle, in which there is not even a mention of hearth and home, factory or district, but in which the proletariat at once, in a striking, sharp, unrestrained and powerful manner, proclaims its opposition to the society of private property. The Silesian uprising begins precisely with what the French and English workers' uprisings end, with consciousness of the nature of the proletariat. Mit dem Bewusstsein über das Wesen des Proletariats. Vorwärts, 10th of August, 1844, end quote. Just as a side note, there is a good deal of dispute about the nature of the Silesian uprising. Like in a lot of uprisings of this time, I think you could definitely say of the French Revolution, and I think you could even say of the Paris Commune, that a lot of the participants were not the doubly free wage laborers in the Marxian sense of the term, but rather semi-artisanal laborers. So it's kind of similar in a sense to like the Luddite movement. It was kind of like a certain degree, I don't really like, it's a certain degree like a petty bourgeois revolt against capitalism in a certain sense. Not that that's bad or anything, but like resistance of people whose livelihoods was being destructed by by competition with other concentrated capital, right? So I'm not exactly sure. I'm not an expert on any of the things I was just talking about, but that is my interpretation. I believe there's a piece on here by Marcel van der Linden titled "The Proletariat," which talks about this, and that's one of like Marcel van der Linden's things, kind of like using Marx against Marx to like kind of like understand the various forms of, I guess what you might call direct laboring under capitalism, right? Marx always talked about the doubly free wage labor, but historically, capitalism has had many other forms of labor that produced value and produced commodities that were sold on the market at a profit for the owners of those commodities. So there's a critique of generic uses of the concept proletariat. Anyway, in the German ideology, Marx would start out from the principle that, quote, the separate individuals form a class only insofar as separate individuals have to carry on a common battle against another class. In other respects, the separate individuals are on hostile terms with each other as competitors, end quote. Marx. And this general law has its ultimate and highest particular application in modern society, quote, thus on the one hand we have a totality of productive forces which have, as it were, taken on a material form and are for the individuals themselves no longer the forces of the individuals but of private property, and hence of the individuals only insofar as they are owners of private property, ... On the other hand, standing against these productive forces, we have the majority of the individuals from whom these forces have been wrested away, and who, robbed thus of all real life content, have become abstract individuals, who are, however, by this very fact put into a position to enter into relation with one another as individuals, miteinander in Verbindung, end quote. The only connection that still binds them to the productive forces in their very existence, labor, has lost in these latter any semblance of personal expression. Their enemy is not, therefore, only the capitalist, but also labor itself. Hence, from the outset, their struggle is directed against the entire social relation. These are the, quote, proletarians of the present time, end quote, a class which, insofar as it has to bear all the burdens of society, end quote, is, quote, forced into sharpest contradiction to all other classes, end quote. It is, quote, a class which forms the majority of all members of society, from which emanates the consciousness of the necessity of a fundamental revolution, einer gründlichen Revolution, end quote. Marx. In all the revolutions that have thus far taken place, indeed, the, quote, mode, art of activity, end quote, has remained unchanged. These have always only had to do with a different distribution of these activities, a new distribution of labor to other people, whereas the, quote, communist revolution is directed against the hitherto existing mode, art, of activity, does away with labor, die Arbeit beseitigt, and abolishes the rule of all classes with the classes themselves, end quote. Marx. A line in the manuscript after, quote, does away with labor, end quote, and was later crossed out and continues with an interrupted definition of labor as, quote, the modern form of activity under which the domination of, end quote. Marcuse seeks to emphasize the gravity of these claims, noting that here there appears the trusty old Aufhebung, which, even as it suppresses, also restores, and so on. Marcuse then notes that this explanation is too banal, and thinks about how he can get rid of the category of the future, that is non-labor, and restore the antiquated Philistine reactionary idea of happiness. But separate from all this, the previous discourse ends as follows. What is needed for both the mass production of this communist consciousness and with the success of the thing itself is a transformation of the mass of humanity, which can take place only in a practical revolutionary movement. Quote, the revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing, die stürzende Klasse, It can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages. ... End quote. Marx. The theoretical struggle against Proudhon achieved a notable leap forward in Marx's analysis of these problems. Not by chance, the Poverty of Philosophy contains Marx's first and important, if not yet satisfactory, definitions of the concept of class. The relations of production that the bourgeoisie moves within present themselves not with a simple single character, but rather with a dual character. Within these same relations, there is the production of wealth, but also of poverty. There is development of the productive forces, but also of a force that produces repression. That is, quote, these relations produce bourgeois wealth, i.e. the wealth of the bourgeois class, only by continually annihilating the wealth of the individual members of this class, and by producing an ever-growing proletariat, end quote. Marx. And this is the basis upon which a struggle develops between the proletarian class and the bourgeois class. This struggle has a whole history of its own, its development in a series of phases that it passes through. Quote, there develops a struggle between the proletarian class and the bourgeois class, a struggle which, before being felt, perceived, appreciated, understood, avowed, and proclaimed aloud by both sides, expresses itself to start with merely in partial and momentary conflicts, in subversive acts, end quote. Marx. Yet the development of modern industry necessarily also leads to coalitions among workers. Workers' first attempt to associate themselves always took this form. Economists and socialists then agreed to tell the workers, do not build coalitions among yourselves. Quote, large-scale industry concentrates in one place a crowd of people unknown to one another. Competition divides their interests, but the maintenance of wages, this common interest which they have against their boss, unites them in a common thought of resistance. Combination. This combination always has a double aim, that of stopping competition among the workers so they can carry on general competition with the capitalists. If the first aim of resistance was merely the maintenance of wages, combinations, at first isolated, constitute themselves into groups of as the capitalists, in their turn, unite for the purpose of repression, and in face of always united capital, the maintenance of the association becomes more necessary to them than that of wages, end quote. Marx. In this struggle, quote, a real civil war, end quote, all the elements that will be necessary for the future battle come together and develop. Once the association has reached this point, it takes on a political character. Quote, economic conditions at first transform the mass of the people of the country into workers. The domination of capital has created for this mass a common situation, common interests. This mass is thus already a class as against capital, but not yet for itself. In the struggle, of which we have pointed out only a few phases, this mass becomes united and constitutes itself as a class for itself. The interest it defends become class interest. But the struggle of class against class is a political struggle, end quote. Marx. Where the hell am I? Taken to its highest expression, this political struggle of class against class between proletariat and bourgeoisie, quote, is a total revolution, end quote. Marx. End quote, indeed. Is it at all surprising that a society founded on the opposition of classes should culminate in brutal contradiction, the shock of body against body as its final denouement, end quote. Combat or death, the bloody struggle or the void, that is the, quote, last word of social science, end quote. Marx. So, when the Second Conference of the Communist League mandated Marx and Engels to write the manifesto, its content was in fact already in Marx's head. The program of the proletarian revolution responded like a fusillade to the bourgeois revolution of February 1848. Quote, the old motto of the League of the Just, quote, all men are brothers, end quote, was replaced by a new Marxist one, quote, working men of all countries unite, end quote, end quote. Too many intellectuals, so-called serious scholars, even ready to admire the scientific marks of capital, shut their eyes in dismay at the raw, wholly political pages of the manifesto. But for us, this text remains a model for a practical intervention of the working class point of view in the class struggle. The battle cry of which Engels spoke lay not only in the final slogan, but in the very construction of the entire text. Quote, but not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to the bourgeoisie's self, the bourgeoisie has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians, end quote. For this is the class of those who are compelled to sell themselves by the minute, who live so long as they can work and find work so long as their labor augments capital. Thus the proletariat passes through different degrees of development, but its, quote, struggle against the bourgeoisie begins with its existence, end quote. First of all, individual workers struggle one by one, and when the workers of a factory struggle, that is, the workers of a given category in a certain place struggle against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. At this stage, the workers form a mass dispersed across the country and divided by competition. As a mass, they are already united, not however, through their own initiative, but through the initiative of the bourgeoisie, which must set the whole proletariat in movement in order to achieve its own political goals. This is the long historical stage in which proletarians do not fight their enemies, but their enemies' enemies. At this point, the whole movement of history is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory is a victory for the bourgeoisie, but with the development of industry, the proletariat multiplies, is internally leveled out, unifies. Its power grows enormously, and together with this, its awareness of its power. The conflict between individual workers and individual bourgeois disappears. What arrives in its place is the open clash between the two classes. The workers form coalitions, unite in associations, and with the latter drive the first forms of struggle, up to and including the pure and simple violence of the riot. Now and then they win, but only ever temporarily. Quote, the real feud of their battles lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers, end quote. Marx. Local struggles linked together and concentrate in a single class struggle against a nation's whole bourgeoisie. Quote, but every class struggle is a political struggle, end quote. There thus emerges the problem of the, quote, organization of the proletarians into a class and consequently into a political party, end quote. Only at this point does the theoretical program of the revolution become practically realizable. The most important condition for the existence and the domination of the bourgeois class is the accumulation of wealth in private hands, the formation and multiplication of capital. But, quote, the condition of capital is wage labor, end quote. The progress of industry, of which the bourgeoisie is the involuntary and passive vehicle, necessarily leads to the association of the workers among themselves, to their, quote, revolutionary union, end quote. With the development of big industry, the very terrain on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products is thus pulled from under its feet. Rather, it produces its own grave diggers. Sie produziert vor allem ihre eigenen Totengräber. In parentheses. Both Marx and Engels repeatedly referred to the, quote, decisive event, end quote, that had taken place in Paris on the 13th of June, 1849. About a month earlier, the two men's time at the Neue Rheinische Zeitung had come to an end with a, quote, glorious defeat, end quote. The experience of the political periodicals had reached its conclusion. About a month earlier, the two men's time at the Neue Rheinische Zeitung had come to an end with a, quote, glorious defeat, end quote. The experience of the political periodical had reached its conclusion. Marx was in Paris. From there, on the 7th of June, Marx wrote to Engels, who was volunteering in Kaiserslautern, among Villech's troops. Quote, never has a colossal eruption of the revolutionary volcano been more imminent than it is in Paris today, end quote. Marx. On the 11th of June, the Juvolin, leader of the Montagnards, asked the Chamber to put Bonaparte and his ministry under investigation for having violated the Constitution. This is another case of an attempt, such as had become traditional since the time of the Convention, at a parliamentary insurrection, quote, an insurrection within the limits of pure reason, end quote. The aim was the same one the democratic petty bourgeoisie had always had, quote, breaking the power of the bourgeoisie without unleashing the proletariat, or letting it appear otherwise than in perspective. The proletariat would have been used without becoming dangerous, end quote. In these conditions, it was natural that the cry, quote, long live the Constitution, end quote, took on no other meaning than, quote, down with the revolution, end quote. Having been consulted, the delegates of the workers' secret associations did the only thing that would have been reasonable to do in that moment. They forced the Montagnards to commit themselves and to break out of the limits of the parliamentary struggle if the bid to charge Bonaparte were thwarted. And indeed it was. But when, on the morning of 13th of June, the Montagnards read the, quote, proclamation to the people, end quote, in the socialist papers, La Démocratie Pacifique and La Réforme, namely the appeal from the petty bourgeois for the proletarians to rise up, they refused to give their backing and watched passively as the Democrats went down to a ridiculous defeat. Quote, during the whole of June 13th, the proletariat maintained the same skeptically watchful attitude and awaited a seriously engaged, irrevocable melee between the Democratic National Guard and the army, in order then to plunge into the fight and push the revolution forward beyond the petty bourgeois aim set for it. In the event of victory, a proletarian commune was already formed, which would take its place beside the official government. The Parisian workers had learned in the bloody school of June 1848, end quote. The battle did not take place. Regular troops mounted a bayonet charge against the peaceful procession by the disarmed National Guards. Only from Lyon did there come the sign, one that was not heeded elsewhere, of a bloody working-class insurrection. But here, quote, where the industrial bourgeoisie and the industrial proletariat stands directly opposed to one another, where the workers' movement is not, as in Paris, included in and determined by the general movement, end quote. In all the other provinces where the lightning struck, it did not catch fire. On the 29th of June, Marx wrote in the Volksfreund, quote, taken as a whole, June 13th, 1849, is only the retaliation for June 1848. On that occasion, the proletariat was deserted by the, quote, mountain, or the Montagnard. This time, the, quote, the, quote, mountain was deserted by the proletariat, end quote. Marx. Quote, if June 23rd, 1848 was the insurrection of the revolutionary proletariat, June 13th, 1849 was the insurrection of the democratic petty bourgeois, each of these two insurrections being the classically pure expression of the class which had been its vehicle, end quote. Marx. But the starting point was still there in June 1848, quote, the most colossal event in the history of European civil wars, end quote, as Marx put it in his 18th Brumaire, quote, on its side stood the finance aristocracy, the industrial bourgeoisie, the middle class, the petty bourgeois, the army, the lumpen proletariat organized as the mobile guard, the intellectuals, the clergy, and the rural population. On the side of the Paris proletariat stood none but itself, end quote. Marx. The bourgeois republic emerged triumphant, quote, with this defeat, the proletariat recedes into the background of the revolutionary stage, end quote. Marx.
The proletariat sought to push itself forward once more, each time that the movement seemed to produce a new upsurge, but did so with ever less energy and with increasingly meager results. As soon as one of the social layers above it entered into revolutionary ferment, the proletariat established ties with it, and the former thus itself shared in all the defeats that the various parties suffered, one after the other. The most outstanding representative of the proletariat gradually fell victims. The most outstanding representatives of the proletariat gradually fell victims to the courts, and increasingly dubious figures took their place. The official workers' movement abandoned the official workers' movement itself to doctrinaire experiments, public exchange banks, and secret workers' associations. It thus, quote, renounced, the revolutionizing of the old world by means of the old world's own great combined resources, and sought, rather to achieve its salvation behind society's back, in private fashion, within its limited conditions of existence, and hence necessarily, suffered, shipwreck, end quote. Marx. Faced with the bourgeois republic, now discovered to me nothing more than the, quote, absolute despotism of a class, end quote, there arose the urgent need for a coalition between the workers and the petty bourgeois. Quote, the revolutionary point was broken off from the social demands of the proletariat and a democratic turn given to them. The purely political form was stripped from the democratic claims of the petty bourgeoisie, and their socialist point turned outward. Thus arose social democracy, end quote. Marx. The revolutionary goal henceforth became, quote, the reformation of society in a democratic way, end quote. Marx. All this is a prelude to the events of June 1849 and explains how, quote, the blaring overture that announced the contest dies away in a faint grumble as soon as the struggle has to begin. The actors cease to take themselves au sérieux, and the action collapses completely like a pricked balloon, end quote. Marx. The deep and real aversion toward the democratic petty bourgeoisie cultivated by the proletariat of June 1848 was stronger than the all-much invoked, quote, great common interest, end quote. It was the first time an autonomous movement, a class movement of proletarians, of workers, escaped the control and plans of the formal democratic logic. Quote, the Democrats concede that a privileged class confronts them, but they, along with all the rest of the nation, form the people. What they represent is the people's rights. What interests them is the people's interests. Accordingly, when a struggle is impending, they do not need to examine the interests and positions of the different classes. They do not need to weigh their own resources too critically. They have merely to give the signal, and the people, with all its inexhaustible resources, will fall upon the oppressors, end quote. Marx. But in practice, quote, their interests proved to be uninteresting, and their potency impotence, end quote. The, quote, indivisible, end quote, people had divided into enemy camps. Quote, das unteilbare Volk in verschiedene feindliche Lager spalten, end quote. From this point, each and every popular uprising would be conditioned by the movements of the working class. The popular masses no longer stood independent from the workers. Popular struggles would no longer even exist without the working class struggle. The people's tribunes were impotent without the power of the workers. Social democracy had lost its political autonomy forever. Henceforth, it would be either a function of capital or a crude, conscious instrument of workers' power. What Marx called the collapse of democratic institutions was not an objective fact that followed from the defeat in 1848, but a subjective initiative that the very workers who had then been defeated took with regard to their former false allies. This would give 13th of June 1849 its true meaning, when for the first time in the refusal of democratic struggle, the workers' passive response to the petty bourgeois call on the workers to limit their demands within the confines of democracy itself emerged as a specific form of working class struggle. So it was not therefore an error, as Machen, Helfen, and Nikolaevsky have commented, but rather another clear-sighted product of Marx's, quote, analytical intelligence, end quote. when, in the wake of the decisive event in Paris in 1849, Marx adjudged that, quote, awkward though the present state of affairs may be for our personal circumstances, I am nevertheless among the satisfaits, or satisfait, I have no idea, satisfaits, les choses marchent très bien, and the Waterloo suffered by the official democracy may be regarded as a victory, end quote. Marx. Lenin could not fail to grasp the significance of this passage in his own way and in terms of the needs of his own struggle. In the preface to the Russian edition of Marx's letters to Kugelmann, he did not only highlight Lenin did not only highlight Marx's enthusiastic approval of the fresh uprising by the Parisian workers in his 12th of April 1871 writing, a text which in Lenin's view ought to be displayed in the bedroom of every revolutionary, quote, of every Russian worker who can read, and quote. Rather, together with this, he also highlighted another consideration, quote, Kugelmann apparently replied to Marx expressing certain doubts, referring to the hopelessness of the struggle and to realism as opposed to romanticism. At any rate, he compared the commune and insurrection to the peaceful demonstration in Paris on the 13th of June, 1849. Marx immediately, on April 17, 1871, severely lectured Kugelmann, end quote. Lenin wrote this before continuing, quote, in September 1870, Marx called the insurrection an act of desperate folly. But when the masses rose, Marx wanted to march with them, to learn with them in the process of the struggle, and not to give them bureaucratic admonitions. Marx realized that to attempt in advance to calculate the chances with complete accuracy would be quackery or hopeless pedantry. What Marx valued above everything else was that the working class heroically and self-sacrificingly took the initiative in making world history. Marx regarded world history from the standpoint of those who make it without being in a position to calculate the chances infallibly beforehand, and not from the standpoint of an intellectual Philistine who moralizes, quote, it was easy to foresee, they should not have taken up, end quote. Marx was also able to appreciate that there are moments in history when a desperate struggle of the masses, even for a hopeless cause, is essential for the further schooling of these masses and their training for the next struggle, end quote. Lenin. Marx sharply reproached Kugelmann in Marx's 17th of April 1871 letter, quote, how can you compare petty bourgeois demonstrations a la the 13th of June 1849, etc., with the present struggle in Paris is quite incomprehensible to me. I'm going to repeat that. I think I fucked it up. Quote, how you can compare petty bourgeois demonstrations a la the 13th of June 1849, etc., with the present struggle in Paris is quite incomprehensible to me. World history would indeed be very easy to make if the struggle were taken up only on conditions of infallibly favorable chances, end quote. Without a doubt, the conditions of the struggle, above all due to the presence in France of the Prussians, were favorable to the workers. Were unfavorable to the workers, The, quote, bourgeois canaille, C-A-N-A-I-L-L-E, of Versailles, knew as much. Quote, precisely for that reason they presented the Parisians with the alternative of taking up the fight or succumbing without a struggle. In the latter case, the demoralization of the working class would have been a far greater misfortune than the fall of any number of, quote, leaders. The struggle of the working class against the capitalist class and its state had entered upon a new phase with the struggle in Paris. Whatever the immediate results may be, a new point of departure of world historic importance has been gained, end quote. All of Marx's political advice to the communards pointed in the direction of a more decisive, more violent resolve, more daring to taking on the open struggle. As Marx put it in his 12th of April 1871 letter to Kugelmann, quote, they did not want to start the civil war, if they are defeated, only their, quote, decency, end quote, will be to blame. They should have marched on it at once on Versailles, end quote. Marx. This would henceforth return in every decisive struggle, in every direct clash, as the watchword for the workers' revolutionary viewpoint, in the face of the leader's internal opportunist call for moderation. Indeed, there is no need to think that the passive refusal to fight for democratic demands is the only specific form of working-class struggle. Rather, it is just one of these forms. The one that always and immediately accompanies it is the class's active refusal to allow itself to be defeated without engaging in battle. And this always brings with it the search, at whatever cost, for an open clash on the terrain of mass struggle. In the first case, the various factions of the class of capitalists are allowed to resolve their unsettled accounts among themselves. The working class's force is spared and kept intact, so that it might instead be deployed as a new and more advanced level of struggle. At this point, there are no demands coming from the working class. In the second case, it is the workers in big capital directly who are settling accounts, and this is the opportunity for all the potential for struggle hitherto accumulated to enter into play. And the degree of violence will now depend only on the greatness of this potential and how well organized it is. A single demand comes forth, one that negates all the others and thus negates itself together with them. Indeed, this is no longer a subjective demand from the workers themselves, but a simple and necessary historical consequence of their existence, their presence as a class. In the inaugural address to the First International in 1864, Marx establishes that, quote, the great task of the working class is the conquest of political power, end quote. Marx. The experience of the Commune took on such importance more as a first general realization of this task than in the terms of the particular ways in which power was organized therein. The Commune was, quote, our party's most glorious action since the June insurrection, end quote. And the, quote, first revolution in which the working class was openly acknowledged as the only class capable of social initiative, end quote. Marx. Marx's writings on the Commune are themselves often considered part of his, quote, historical works. It is often forgotten that they were addresses by the General Council of the International Workingmen's Association regarding the Civil War in France. When Marx defined the Commune as a, quote, essentially working class government, end quote, quote, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor, end quote, Marx was not making an empirical observation or still less a historical judgment, but drawing a simple political watchword. The proletariat of Marx's first works, a force for dissolving the old world, had here become a working class, a social power that decisively snatches the offensive weapon of power from the hands of the capitalists. The political form has changed, the social composition has transformed, the structural economic power has shifted and grown, the level of struggles has repeatedly leapt forward. All this took place. Mosquito. Oh, here. Where the hell am I? All this took place within the permanently erupting revolutionary volcano that is the class of workers. But the objective, the purpose, the program with which to assail and bring down the rotten old world, which is not different to, but rather forms a single whole together with capital's most modern social forms and its modern power apparatus, all this remains identical throughout the passage from proletarians to workers. And this demonstrates another thing, that on the political terrain there is also, and must continually be, the inverse passage from the modern working class forms to the crude proletarian forms of the class struggle. If we do not want to remain within the this time truly apparent game of concerted, quote, conflictual evolution in the relations between the two enemy classes. The point that unifies the forms of struggle is always precisely in the objective, the purpose, the program. Amid so much transformation, this is the thing that does not and cannot change. On this, in 1871, Marx repeated almost to the letter what Marx had said in 1843, quote, the working class did not expect miracles from the Commune. The working class had no ready-made utopias to introduce par decret du peuple. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I'm not saying it right, but I don't know in what way I'm not saying it right. They know that in order to work out their own emancipation, and along with it that higher form to which present society is irresistibly tending by its own economical agencies, They will have to pass through long struggles, through a series of historic processes, transforming circumstances and men. They have no ideals to realize, but to set free elements of the new society with which old collapsing bourgeois society itself is pregnant." End quote. Thus, the afternoon of the 13th of June, 1849, when the most active members of the proletariat watched the Democrats' procession from the pavement, and the morning of 19th of March, 1871, when the obscure figures of the Central Committee governed Paris alone, provided two opposed and specific forms of the working class struggle. They are two limited models, between which are located an infinite, extraordinarily varied series, which always rich in new, quote, technical inventions regarding the practical applications of those elementary reforms which, as such, remain the complete expression at the political level of working class antagonism. Analyzing the forms of struggle is an important passage in reconstructing the working class point of view we seek, and it would be necessary to insist on this analysis in future with particular studies. Once we resolve the problem of what workers set forward as their purpose, it is necessary to understand what the working class is. This is not possible without seeing how it struggles. And that's the end of chapter 7 of Mario Tronti's Marx Labor Power Working Class, translated by David Broder. Thank you so much for listening.